Hello and welcome to the Gold Goats and Guns podcast for August 11th, 2025. My name is Tom Luongo. We've got a lot to talk about. It's episode 227, and I have with me the great pleasure of having back on the cast, as I advertised, Brent Johnson is here with me today of Santiago Capital. But before I bring Brent in, if you care about your liberty and the right to control your own future, I need to inform you of something very cool. From October 10th to the 12th, Mikhail Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, is bringing together top experts from around the world for the Expat Money Online Summit. It's completely free to attend. You'll learn how to legally protect your wealth, secure second residences and citizenships, reduce your tax burden, and own property abroad, all to safeguard your freedom. This year's focus is Latin America, where the opportunities are booming. Argentina is shifting to free markets. El Salvador is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and Panama and Paraguay are offering simple residency programs. Plan B is no longer optional, folks. It's essential. So reserve your free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. Brent, how are you? How you been, man?
I'm good. Had a good summer. Had some family stuff going on with trips and travel and vacation, but now my son's going back to school tomorrow and kind of back at it. So it's here we go.
I think it's a common theme for everybody, to be honest with you, right? I know I actually took a vacation for the first time forever. As a matter of fact, I was chatting with my friend Alex Craner on the last episode of the podcast, and we spent like 35 minutes talking about Alex actually going on vacation for the first time in like 5 years or 6 years. And I remember, it is hard when you're building a business out, how hard it is how hard you have to work. And I don't think people really realize just how hard we work, sometimes. And
my wife, I don't know. I suppose everybody does this, but I work a lot on the weekends too. It's like, it's not just during the week, and it's not just during market hours. Like my wife is always like, what are you doing in there? I'm like, I'm working. Like there's always when you're looking at macro stuff and geopolitical stuff, the market's never closed. Something's always happening somewhere. Right.
Yeah.
And it's easier to try to keep up with it than try to catch up. Because if you take a week off or 2 weeks off and you try to catch up, you're screwed.
I especially in this environment. I think we're in the acceleration phase where everything is the pressure cooker for everybody at the geopolitical level, and certainly at the kind of the big 40,000 foot, what's this all really mean level. And, obviously I cover that. I focus on that more than anything else, because look, to me, it's like, if you don't understand the parameters of what the actual fight is, then you can't understand the moves that are being made on the chessboard. And so, you have to keep up with it all the time. It's impossible not to.
At least it's interesting. That makes it easier, right? I don't dread going to work in the morning, and I'm not sitting here at my desk like counting the minutes until I can leave. I actually really love it. But it does get intense sometimes.
Well, I'll say this, like, people ask, it's like, all I did was turn my hobby into my job. Right.
Yeah.
As my old career as a chemist ended, because I didn't have enough education really, to, be qualified for the jobs that I would actually, be able to run a laboratory, run a research group or whatever. You can't do that with a BS in chemistry. It's not, and no MBA. You cannot do it. It's not possible in today's America. So I wound up just taking my hobby and, kind of converting it into what I do now. And it's kind of cool. Like, from that perspective.
Yeah. There's a lot going on, right? There's a lot going on all over the place. And so,
I agree.
It's really exciting because the thing that makes it interesting for me is that when I went to business school, I went to a school called Thunderbird, and most people have never heard of Thunderbird, but Thunderbird was at the time the #1 ranked school for international business in the world. And there was no undergraduate associated with it. So it was a very small school. It was basically a business technical school for international business. And I think, this was 30 years ago, literally, actually, now that I think about it, it was literally 30 years ago this week that I started there. And,
wow.
At the time, it was kind of unique to focus on international business. And now every MBA program in the world has an international focus and international classes and, different languages. But at the time, I kind of felt like it was doing something a little bit different. And my very first class, was called International Political Economy. And they basically taught us about the rules-based order. And we learned words like hegemon and what the World Bank did and what the purpose of the United Nations was. And, basically the whole rules-based order how it was set up, why it was set up, and what it meant for doing business on the global stage.
Right.
And, I would love to be able to go back there now, knowing what I know now, because it would be fascinating to be kind of either, push back on the teachers a little bit or debate with them a little bit.
Sure.
But the fascinating thing for me is that, I've known how that was set up and I've known how that works. And I always thought it was fascinating, but now to see Trump dismantle it is quite fascinating as well. And I think if you don't understand how it was set up and why it was set up and the way it was meant to function, then you don't really understand the big things that Trump's doing. It just looks like chaos. Right. But I believe that there actually is a method to the madness. Now, I'm not saying that Trump himself isn't a little bit mad, and I'm not saying he has everything perfectly worked out.
Right.
But when you understand what the system was meant to do before and how he is kind of surgically dismantling it, you can kind of see what he's up to. And I really think we're in a place now where that, pardon the pun, trumps everything else. And I largely believe this would be happening whether Trump was president or not. And it wouldn't be happening as fast, and it might not be happening in the same way. But I think a lot of the dynamics that we're going to see play out over the next 5 or 10 years would play out regardless of who is in the White House. But I think if you are going to play this game, and it looks like this game is going to be played, you do want someone like, whether you want like Trump or not, you want someone like him, at the helm, because I think it's going to be very volatile.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And before we started recording, we weren't quite sure which direction we're going to go. I now know which direction we're going to go. We're going to draw on your experience about all of that. So because I agree with everything you just said about in conceptually about the skill set that Donald Trump brings to the table, the mindset that he brings to the table in this moment in time. He's, I think, the perfect general for the job in that respect. Now, does he have deficits? Does he have personality flaws, that could get him into trouble? Sure. But we'll leave that for the later stage of the podcast. I want to go back to what you said originally about, let's talk about how the rules-based order was actually set up. Everybody thinks they know something about it and they think they understand it. I mean, that includes myself. So I want to actually hear what you were taught about this. And then just so that we can get some primitives and some foundations, because I think there's a lot of conversation that goes on out there. And I think there's a lot of conflating of terms, there's a lot of conflating of ideas and people's agendas. And it's not necessarily what everybody says, understands. It doesn't actually work the way we think it all actually does work. So why don't you start there? That'd be great.
Yeah. So I'll say I was taught one side of the story, and it wasn't until many years down the road that I learned the other side of the story. And as with that, I apologize. There's some construction going on outside my apartment that just started. I hope you can't hear it.
I can. Actually, Zoom's
okay.
AI. It's filtering it all out. It's great.
Great. And I was taught kind of the fairy tale, for lack of a better word, and that is essentially that the United States and its allies were the winners of World War II. They stopped the spread of the Nazis and communism, and in order to prevent a horrible world war like that ever happening again, they set up a number of institutions to prevent a conflict like that from happening again, and to promote peace, promote economic efficiency, and to promote stability. That and to perpetuate Western quote unquote values. Sure. That was essentially the purpose of the rules-based order. Now, the flip side that I've learned later is that while that I actually do think that was true. But there's also another side to it, and that it was a system of control that benefited the winner, right? The U.S. sat at the top of that rules-based order, and the rules were largely dictated by the person sitting, or the country, United States, sitting at the top of that rules-based order. And most of those rules applied to everybody except for the entity sitting at the top of that rules-based order. And if the entity at the top ever wanted to do something against the rules-based order, well, then the rules just needed to change. Right. And it took me a long time probably to figure that out, but I eventually did, right? But when you think about it, like part of the reason of having the United Nations was to have a forum where people could go and they could air their grievances with certain, mechanisms in place that if they were right, there were some enforcement mechanisms that could make their case be enforced. But it was a place for them to go that they could air their grievances rather than doing it with rifles and tanks and trenches and, nuclear bombs. And there was the World Bank was set up in order, to promote growth around the world, and the International Monetary Fund was set up as a way to fund developing nations so they could rise out of poverty and not, be exploited by colonial powers. And there is truth to that, but there's an ugly truth to it too, is that the people, again, not just the U.S., but the U.S. and its allies that sat on the top of this pyramid, could use those rules and use those forums to get their way, whether they were right or not.
Right.
And in many of these cases, whether that was the WTO, whether it was, again, the United Nations, whether it was NATO, whether it was, and all of these are part of the rules-based order, right? It's a spider web. It starts at the top and then it just kind of spiders webs down. A lot of times it was done. It's not that it was done to the detriment of the United States, but it was done for the greater good of the alliance or NATO or the Western powers. And sometimes in doing that, while it would benefit the U.S. in some ways, it would greatly hurt the United States in other ways. You can talk about globalization, and when you let China into the WTO, and then all the jobs move to China, and that's great for the United States stock market. It's not so great for the Iron Belt and the Rust Belt and the manufacturing jobs. And so, while it benefited certain parts of America, it did not benefit other parts of America. And I would also argue that in doing that, it may have helped a couple families and a couple of the elite in those developing countries, but it often did not help the average citizen of those other countries as well, right? And debt diplomacy was a big part of the rules-based order. And China has kind of tried to create that on their own with the bridge and road, right? Kind of the bridge and road is in many ways a copycat version of the rules-based order, or not necessarily a copycat, but a similar type of a program, where it looks like you're doing it for altruistic reasons, and perhaps there are some altruistic intentions, but ultimately it benefits the person doing those actions, right? Extending that olive branch. And so I don't think someone like Trump would ever get elected if there wasn't some downsides to this rules-based order, and if there wasn't some domestic downsides to the rules-based order. And I was in college, and I was literally just kind of starting to study this stuff when Ross Perot came on the scene, right? And he was talking about this giant sucking sound going to Mexico and our jobs fleeing across the seas. And I kind of understood it, but the vision that he had. And then there was another guy, Sir James Goldsmith from London, or from England, who gave a similar speech back then that said the same thing was going to happen. And you go back and you look at it now, and you're almost like, these guys are wizards, man. They saw this 30 years ago, right, how it would develop, and they've been right. They've been totally vindicated. And as a result, there's a lot of inequality. The inequality, not just in the rest of the world, but in the United States, has greatly expanded over that last 30 years. And it's that inequality that has let someone like Trump, use his, you can call it nationalist rhetoric, you can call it populist rhetoric, however you want to define it. He talks about things that are related to the common guy in Main Street, as opposed to, the international elite and Wall Street. And that allowed him to get elected. And while I think there's again, two sides to every story, I think he knew that by saying that it would help him get elected, but I think he believes it. And the reason I think he believes it is he has literally been saying it for 30 years. You can go back and find interviews of Trump in the late 80s and the early 90s where he said the same thing. So it's not like he just changed his tune in order to get elected. He's believed this for a long time. And so when you see him go at the WTO, when you see him go at the United Nations, when you see him go at, the rules-based order as a thing that's for the greater good rather than for the greatness of the United States, then you can understand why he wants to bring it down. He will argue it's helped a certain faction of the United States, but it hasn't helped the majority of the United States. And he has basically said those days are over, right? I mean,
No,
in
he
no
really has.
uncertain terms.
Mm-hmm.
And, not only has he said it, but he has followed up with it. You would never have had the trade war or tariff war, however you want to describe what's gone on last year, via the rules-based order. Because and if you did, it would have taken 5 years to play out, because that's the way the rules-based order handled it. It went through the WTO, it went through multilateral agreements, and there was 18 conferences and 150 phone calls, and Trump just basically said, no, we're not doing it that way.
We're not doing it
And
that way.
so, and the thing is if you are going, and the other thing I'll say is, and I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but it's all related. Like, the rules-based order is very much enmeshed with the deep state. You hear the term the deep state. The deep state was created in many ways by the rules-based order, or they were kind of created together, and they have grown together. So it would be impossible for Trump to take on the quote unquote deep state without bringing down some of the rules-based order. And this is not an easy thing to do. I mean, you have to understand these institutions are very big. They're very powerful. The people that work there are not idiots. I know that's another thing. I think there's this common view that all the people in Washington are a bunch of idiots, and I'm not going to sit here and say that they're all geniuses. They're not. But they certainly have made their fair share of mistakes. But the people at the top, they are probably as clever and ruthless as any people that have ever existed. Mm-hmm. And to think that they're not, I think you're doing yourself a very big disservice. You should never underestimate your enemy, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so I think Trump tried to do this a little bit in his first term, got shut down pretty quickly. Yep. And then I think he just got so pissed off when he wasn't in office and on the last campaign trail that he said, you know what, screw it, this time we're really doing it. And he put people, I think his cabinet this time is much more prepared and much more willing to do his bidding, for lack of a better word, than the previous administration.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet and kick it to you for a minute, is that in a lot of this stuff, when I talk about this stuff, this is not necessarily the way I would handle it. This is not necessarily the way I think is the right way to do it. But I try not to waste my time figuring out what I would do or what the right thing would be to do, because that doesn't help me manage money. What I focus on is what's actually going to happen and what this person's actually going to do and whether or not they can do it. Yep. Because that's what's going to impact markets. And so I don't want people to think that, I'm all for tariffs and I'm all for U.S. bombing Iran and I'm all for, U.S. walking around as the big bully. I don't really like that, but that's the way it is. So that's the world I have to operate in.
Yeah, no, it's what you just described is what I've said literally from the days when I was like ranting into my phone on Periscope with my hat and and a rye whiskey, getting drunk, saying, "Look, this is the world I've got, not the world I want. I'm not analyzing the world I want. I'm trying to figure out the world I've got, and then trying to push towards how we can get to the world we want. Right? And we all want blah, and we can't get there. And this is one of the things that this is where we are today. We're in this kind of transition state from the old rules-based order to a different type of, there's going to be new rules. There's going to be a new rules-based order when this is all done. The question is who's setting those rules. And Europe and the quote unquote West, the old winners, as you describe them, and what I like to call Davos plus the United States, they set up that system and they used it to arrogate power, wealth. They still ran their colonialist playbook. They told us it was the end of colonialism while they kept running the old colonialist playbook. Exactly. Straight out of, City of London, straight out of the Dutch, straight out of France. It's all, and even, and we, as Americans, when we conquered North America, we did the same thing. Like we just looked at, it's manifest destiny and all the rest of this stuff. Right. So but that mindset is now, over. And we used the central banking model. We used debt diplomacy. We used all these things in order to gain as much as possible. The level up for me was when I realized that they're trying to destroy what's left of the US by getting us involved in wars that will destroy what's left of the manufacturing base and the primacy of the United States, while it's simultaneously invading the United States, giving us an opium war, giving us, unrestrained immigration, giving us anti-democratic systems. The deep state was designed to build a technocratic state that mirrors what we're seeing in the European Union now, and what we saw in many ways in the USSR and every other technocratic state we've ever seen, which is that you can have the veneer of democracy in order to keep the people in line, give them a voice and a means by which to an escape valve, a pressure release valve, but nothing actually ever changes. Like, you get to choose between two globalist shitbags for president, right?
Right.
And that's not acceptable. So that system was beginning to break down. I always go back to the day that Ron Paul took down Rudy Giuliani in the debate stage during the primaries in 2008 was the beginning of the end of the rules-based order, and it was happening at the exact same time that they were pulling what I thought was a liquidation. In hindsight, now I think the global financial crisis of 2008 was another step along the way of liquidating the United States, like by taking out our banks and taking and all of that. So there's the way you use interest rates and currency arbitrage. The old colonial powers of Europe understood this model very, very well, and they've understood it for hundreds of years, either using trade flows. When we were on a hard currency standard, it was using trade flows, and then on a fiat currency standard, using interest rate rigging and currency rigging in order to enforce arbitrages that benefited them at the expense of everybody else. And that's what they did. And then they got cockblocked. They got cockblocked by Putin in Russia, who said that's enough and threw all the globalists out. They got cockblocked by Xi in China early on. He did the same thing, trapped all their money there, kept the wall up, and that was why Xi. I think that in hindsight, that's why I think Xi was brought to power. And then the same thing started happening in the United States, and you'll notice that the one big economic bloc that refuses to reform this at all and has actually doubled down on all of this surveillance and debt diplomacy and everything else is the European Union. And so when you look at the game board from that perspective, you realize that when Trump comes to power in 2024, this year, he looks at everything post-COVID, what they did to get rid of him post-COVID and everything else. It's very, very clear that he's like, yep, no, we're moving forward. Your point about the cabinet, by the way, is the point that Dexter White and I made back when we watched the cabinet being formed. We said, this is a war cabinet.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
And it's probably not the polite way to do it. It's not the, nice, peaceful way, but like that, literally, if you were building a war cabinet, you wouldn't build it any differently.
Right. You wouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was all about setting up a cabinet. The way we described it originally was there was a cabinet that did not need Congress. The focus of the first 6 months of his presidency was to get past the need for Congress to be able to step and get in his way. That's why the one big beautiful bill, for all of its faults, if you have faults with it, you want to go through it and find chapter and verse where there were faults with it. The whole point of it was to fund the government through the midterms so that he didn't have to go back to Congress for anything, and would clear his domestic political decks to do everything he needs to do in order to take on this process. And so once that was done, notice how he shifted back to international relations. Like literally the day after the one big beautiful bill is passed through the Congress and reconciliation, he's off around the world. He's cutting trade deals. He's he's inviting people in and ending wars and holding personal. And now soon, 4 days from now, he and Putin are finally going to sit down for a chat. And even if the chat, and I think there's just one last thing. Even if nothing comes from that meeting, other than the fact that they met in Alaska, that's all that needs to happen.
I'll tell you what, Trump meeting Putin in Alaska is another effort to chop the legs off the rules-based order.
Exactly.
Because the rules, one of the institutions in the rules-based order is the International Criminal Court.
Mm-hmm.
And the International Criminal Court has an international arrest warrant out for Putin. If he steps foot in any nation that's part of this thing, then he should be arrested. Well, again, it just shows you that that rules-based order doesn't apply if the United States doesn't back it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when Putin lands in Alaska and he's not arrested, which he won't be arrested. Anybody who's thinking that they're going to arrest Putin when he lands in Alaska is, they're off in dreamland.
Right.
That will immediately make that ICC arrest warrant null and void because the United States isn't enforcing it. Right now, theoretically, could someplace in Europe enforce it if he landed there? Sure, they could, but that's not going to have very good consequences, right?
No.
And so I think Trump meeting with Putin in Alaska is very iconic. That's not the right word. I'm trying to think. It's very it has kind of the shades of Russia, of Gorbachev and Reagan back, in the early 1980s. Yes. Because here's the thing. You either want peace or you want war, right? And I know there's a lot of people out here saying, well, they both really want war. And there's definitely people out there saying Putin wants war. He's a bully. And there's other people saying Trump wants war. He's a bully. But, I know that there's going to be a picture with Trump and Putin. And there's going to be some people that are saying Trump is appeasing Putin. He's going to give away some of Ukraine to Putin. Shouldn't be doing this. Putin's a war criminal. And we shouldn't make peace with this enemy. But the reality is your enemy is who you make peace with. You don't have to make peace with your friends. It's not necessary. So if you want peace, you have to meet the enemy. And if you want peace, especially a lasting peace, you have to give up something. Unless you're going to go to a full-scale war, which is what World War II was, right? And you are ready to push the ultimate button, which Truman did, you're not going to have peace without giving something away, right? Now, I don't think any of us want either Putin or Trump to do what Truman did, right? So anything short of that, you're going to have to give something up. Each side's going to have to give something up. But that's how you come to peace. And so you either want war or you want peace. Now, I personally would much prefer peace. I've got a 17-year-old son, and the last thing I want is some kind of a war breaking out in the next 5 to 10 years that, all 18 to 35-year-old males get shipped off to and put into a meat grinder. Yep. So I would love this war to come to an end. And if Trump can do that, then, great. But I think the point of it is, I do think it's a very important meeting. And I do think the only way the war is going to end is giving something to Russia. They're going to have to get something, right? They are not going to go back to Moscow, pull all of their troops back, give away all the ground that they've taken. That is not going to happen. No. And anybody who thinks it is just not being realistic, unless we go to a full-scale war, right? And like I said, that I don't think we're going to go to a full-scale war with Russia in Ukraine. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think it could have happened if Trump wasn't president, but I don't think it's going. I don't think it's going to happen now that Trump is.
So, and generally speaking, I agree with you. I also believe that Trump is willing to punch Putin in the mouth in order to.
Oh yeah.
To get to that
I agree
point.
With you.
I don't, and we've been spitballing about those scenarios, in kind of realpolitik terms, right? Like what would have to happen here? The Europeans clearly are braying for war. Zelensky has not moved his demands 1 inch, and he keeps losing territory on a daily basis. Putin has prosecuted this war in such a way as to not invoke the ire of the Europeans to the point where they could generally scream, "Oh my God! Look, he's trying to do do everything." So you're right. Like the way to a lasting peace is, as always in any negotiation, and Trump understands this because he's negotiated more big deals than anybody else ever, which is a really good lasting deal, especially in geopolitical terms, means that everybody walks away a little unhappy. Meaning
Exactly.
Putin's going to walk away a little unhappy. He's going to have to give up grand dreams of Odessa, and
Yep.
you know, and Europe is going to have to give up their grand dreams of leaving a Ukraine capable of spinning this war back up 20 years from now.
Yep. Yeah,
And
I think that's right.
and I don't know what that I still to this I've been thinking about this forever and a day, and I don't know what that actually looks like. But what I can say is this: this is one of the things that that looks obvious to me. It's not just that Trump is trying to break down the rules-based order. What he's trying to do, well, he is, but the reason he's doing that is to try and gain Putin's trust in some ways. And because trust between the Americans and the Russians are at historic lows, designed that way on purpose by people who have crafted previous policy. Obama, Biden, Blinken, this one, that one, Hillary Clinton, all of them. The British, blah, 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 blah. And the way you do that is, and I've been saying this for a while now, you have to take away Europe's ability to actually have any control over U.S. policy and U.S. military policy and U.S. foreign policy in the region. And so how do you do that? Well, you go to your castle in Scotland and you summon the head of the European Commission and the UK Prime Minister, and you bring them there on your helicopter on their soil.
Yep.
And you say, you are done. Putin is not, the optics are not lost on Putin.
I talked about on that exact thing on my show this weekend. Like that is very symbolic, right? I mean, it just is like, and it's another example of of doing things a new way. Yeah. Now, one thing I will say is, at the beginning I said I typically do not focus on what I want to happen. I focus on what I think is going to happen. When we were just talking about Trump and Russia and the wars, I did kind of veer into what I want to see happen. Because the last thing I want is a war, right? But the reason I'm bringing this back up because I don't know what's going to happen. A lot of people say, "Oh, this is definitely going to happen." I don't know. I think I understand what Trump is trying to do, right? And I think I know the lengths with which he will go to do it, but I don't know for sure. And so I do think Europe would prefer to keep fighting. But they do not have the ability to do that without the United States. So what I think they would prefer is that the U.S. keep fighting, or the Europe keep fighting predominantly with Ukrainian citizens and United States money, right? I think that's what Europe would prefer, but I just don't think that, in my opinion, that's not going to happen.
Well, J.D. Vance over the weekend made it abundantly clear that if Europe wants to fight, they can do so, and we will provide them the weapons, but we will not provide them the troops. You can pay for these weapons, and Trump has already made that clear. And this is the part about what you and I originally were going to talk about this morning before in the pre-roll, which was the state of the commentariat, the state of the zeitgeist within the commentariat of everybody having kind of made their bones about what they want to believe is going on here, right? And in order to, and again, the reason why I asked you to go over the primitives of the rules-based order was to remind everybody to look seriously about what's actually happening and what has happened in the past. And in this case, the past is not prologue. We are in a different game board. We're in a different state. This is a different game state. There are different players at the table now. You can no longer look at the United States plus the EU as the collective West. There is no collective West right now with Donald Trump in power. And that is really challenging a lot of people's worldviews. And so what has been uncovered is who's really nothing more than a pro-Russia shill, who's a pro-China shill, who's a pro-EU shill, who's a pro-UK shill, yada, 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 who's a neocon, who's a this shill, who's a that shill. And I hate to be blunt about this like that, but it's and it's been very, very disconcerting for me, and it's been very, very disappointing for me to watch this happen with people. I'll be honest with you, people who I would have considered friends, but I'm watching it happen in the space, and the histrionics and the hysterics over this and the quote unquote blackpilling are just ridiculous, because you're missing the forest for the little bitty trees that will allow you to hold on to your version of reality that no longer exists. I don't know if that's what you're seeing, but I know that's what I'm seeing.
So sort of related to that, you said what is past is no longer prologue. I would put an asterisk next to that, and I would say what is immediately past is no longer prologue. But
Fair.
if you want to go back a couple hundred years, that is very much prologue. And what I
Oh, I
mean
agree.
by that,
I think I
yeah,
know where you're going with this, but
yeah. And so, I started off talking about the rules-based order as it, whether you believe it was altruistic or nefarious, it was a system of control. That's what the rules are intended to do. Rules are meant to control things. Now, again, you can decide whether they're good or evil, but that's the purpose of putting rules in place, is control. And I would argue that in the 80 to 100 years, however you want to define this, right, of the most recent rules-based order, it was kind of like free-range farming. In other words, you
Okay.
weren't locked up in pens as strictly as some other farms. And, you had the ability to go out and graze and run around in the fields. But at the end of the day, you were still a piece of livestock, right? And that's what I would say. The rules-based order, especially for the West, was largely democratic. It was largely, for a while there, it was laissez-faire, right? As we've moved forward, those rules have gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. But I think we're going back to a system of what it was before the rules-based order was put in place, when it was a more, I don't want to use the word cruel, but it was a more restricted world. Power was more obvious, as opposed to, like, for most of human history, society was driven top down, right? It was every little kingdom or state or country, however you want to, it was a top down power structure. And, the rules based order kind of was a very nice little marketing gimmick to say that it is now bottoms up. And in many ways, it was, because I don't think people have a proper appreciation for how unique the United States political experiment is in history. The idea that the governed determined the rules, as opposed to the government determining the rules, was really the first time in history that was done on any scale. And I would argue that is what made the United States so unique and so strong, and eventually led them to becoming the global hegemon, right? Or the world's superpower. But that is a very, very unique period of history. That has very rarely happened. In the few occasions it has happened, it hasn't lasted very long. That's why and this is exactly why Benjamin Franklin said, "Well, gentlemen, you have your republic if you can keep it," right? Because usually you can't, right?
Right.
Now it's taken a couple hundred years, but the republic is in danger. And
without a doubt.
Right. And some people think that that's a good thing, that the republic is in danger. Some people think the republic being in danger is a horrible thing. But I would argue we're moving away from a quote unquote, laissez-faire, free range republic into a more controlled power down, top down power structure. And I think this is happening all over the world, by the way. I don't think this is just the United States, but I do think it's happening in the United States as well. And this is why when people tell me, tariffs will not work, or, this will not work, or what he's putting in place will not work. And when I say him, I mean Trump. And I say, it may not work the way you want it to work, and it may not work the way we would prefer it to work, but it worked for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? It's only in the last 100 years that it was done differently in many cases. And so it may not work as efficiently. It may not work as nicely. It may not work as politely or efficiently, but it will work.
Mhm.
And I think, and so that's kind of where I focus at it. Like, to me, that we're just moving into a period of less choice, unfortunately, and more top-down power. And I think there's this belief, it kind of mirrors the whole woke thesis, right? It's like people believe that just because something is bad, it won't happen, or it can't happen, or it can't be allowed. But bad things happen all the time.
Sure.
Like, just because it isn't the nicest system doesn't mean it won't, quote unquote, work.
Well,
Again, I don't necessarily want this to happen. This is not the point I'm trying to make.
right. I
But my
understand.
point is that for hundreds of years, top-down power structures did work. It worked for the people at the top. It didn't perhaps work for the people at the bottom. But the interesting thing I think about this is I actually, while Trump is definitely out for himself, I also think he is out for the common man. I actually do think he is trying to help the little guy. And I don't think he cares as much about the elite, quote unquote, as perhaps some of his predecessors. I'm not saying he doesn't care about himself, and I'm not saying he's not going to enrich himself in this process. But I do think that he wants to bring back jobs to the United States. I do think that he wants to make the United States safer. I do think he wants to make the United States not dependent on its biggest adversary for national defense.
Mhm.
And so I do think there is a method to the madness of this new kind of top-down power structure that no longer, pays heed to the rules-based order.
Well, it's interesting you put it. The way I would say is that the rules based order was the top down power structure, and what we've seen is it looks decentralized, but it really isn't. And what we've seen is Vince Lonsky and I have gone back and forth on this, and he always used the term, look, mercantilism is returning. We're going to put up protection. We're putting up protection barriers, putting up tariffs. Everybody's going, and you look at how Putin, for example, and Xi both have been able to stop the globalist free trade, free flow of money, hot money flow, where you can create money out of thin air and then use it to infiltrate and take political control. Their response to this, and I hate to echo anything Alexander Dugin says, but at a certain level, I know I am, which is that what they did was they used their effectively strong unitary executives or strong unitary state in order to just say, that's enough. We have to do X, Y, and Z in order to get this done, in order to be able to see that power back later. We have to defend ourselves, and you have to trust in the leadership that we have in order to get this done. Putin's gotten that trust and that buy-in, and he put a plan in place, and he executed on that plan as best as Russia could, given the dire circumstances of when Putin took over at the turn of the century. And now here we are 25 years later. He's rebuilt the country in many ways. That's not to say that the country is solved or is, but it is in a far better state, and it's far better prepared to be able to walk away from the rules-based order and be its enemy. Okay. Now, he's their enemy in their minds because he refuses to knuckle under to their authority. Trump is doing effectively the same thing. The managerial state, invoking James Burnham here, or whatever you want to call it, the managerial state, the technocratic state that they've envisioned, and they envision this, by the way, they're now trying to jump the shark and move to AI for this, to impose a new form of feudalism. But they envision that for the U.S. as well, and the U.S. is saying, nuts to that. No, we are going to we're going to use all of the leverage that we actually have. This is one of the things when I was getting to, this is where you and I are, I think, are very much aligned in the current zeitgeist, even though we've come to this in different ways. And, we both talked about this previously when you've been on the show, which is that, that ultimately all of these dollar bearers, all of these, all of these, BRICS bullies or whatever you want to call them, and they're all over the place. And I yell at Bitcoiners about the same thing. I said, you all have operated in a place where you were watching the United States willingly torch itself and not use the weapons it has at its disposal. And you think you're winning. And you have no idea what it looks like when the United States actually decides to use everything in its power to defend
when they
itself.
focus on you, it will be
Right.
much different.
It's you don't want you don't know what that looks like, and you're angry. And I'm just serious. There's a lot of people out there who are just flat out angry at the fact that the United States is defending itself and winning. And I'm sorry, but the trade deal that he forced on the European Union, classic example of this. He's still negotiating with China, but I got news for you. China's, has already accepted, a framework that is far worse than they ever wanted in the first place. It's happening over and over again, and now he's moving the ball forward to also end the central bank era. And I don't want to go ahead of. I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about this. But I just throwing this out there because I know you and I'm doing this on purpose. I don't want to belabor that point, but he's clearly setting up to end central banks and bring control of the money back under the Treasury, and to deprecate the Federal Reserve's centrality to our financial system. And he's also doing that because it's part of the process to break down the rules that rules-based order. And we're going to have a decentralized system that's going to become digitized, but it's actually going to be a weird form of return to a low. I hesitate to call it hard money system, but it's going to be a much lower leverage based system of finance, and trade is going to be accounted for, and price discovery is going to start coming back, and risk assessment is going to come back and be much more market driven. We're actually going to wind up with a much more decentralized system. Russia's going to run theirs, China's going to run theirs, the European Union can run whatever horrible system they want, and we're going to run ours. And I got news for you: the dollar is not dead, folks. It's internationalizing in a way that we've never seen, we've never even considered before. And so I think much of the zeitgeist in the political commentary space at this point, it's like no one wants to admit this. And I'm watching it every day, and I'm like, how could you miss this? And then, like I said earlier, it says you reveal ultimately what Donald Trump's superpower is the ability to reveal, is to pressure somebody to the point where he reveals what their true agenda is and what their true perspective is. And he's done it brilliantly. And if you watch, you see it.
Yeah. So you've kind of ventured, we touched on this at the very beginning. You're kind of bringing it back to this, and that I feel very, very fortunate to have, had the education that I had, and the fact that, I did not come to finance because I loved numbers and I loved the idea of investing. I came to finance because I loved figuring out what was going on in the world. I loved reading the newspapers when I was a kid. I just wanted to know what was going on in the world. And that eventually led me to investing. And I feel like for a long time that didn't necessarily, it sort of helped, but it was one of the lesser advantages, or one of the lesser things that helped. But I feel like that's becoming more and more important now, because what I said at the beginning is, or I've said it before, is that I think for the last 20 or 30 years, if you were a Western-based investor or analyst, for the most part, you could run the numbers on a spreadsheet, and if they penciled out on the spreadsheet, you could run that project or that investment and it would work. I don't think that necessarily is the case anymore, because I think things will still get funded and things will still happen, and they may even be profitable if they don't initially pencil out on the spreadsheet, because I think things will happen for strategic reasons, for U.S. national security reasons, for, just this is what the president want reasons. Right? I think that I think geopolitics, the grand chessboard, I think that is going to trump many the things that would not necessarily pencil out perfectly economically. So I think we're moving into that era, and money is a very big part of that. And I think that's what you were starting to touch on with the Treasury and the Fed. And what I don't think many people understand about money And in this, we get back to two sides of the story on this as well. Is there's a lot of people who believe, and I don't, this is something, this is, I don't necessarily disagree with this. It's just that I think it's much more than this. A lot of people say money is the most marketable commodity that was decided by the satisfied the double coincidence of wants. And it started off as, trading goats for fishes. And over time, gold became money. And I think there's some truth to that, right? And they will say money existed without the state. And I think that probably did happen in certain cases, and it could happen if there was truly a free market. But there has very rarely in history been a truly free market. And I think money has more often than not been associated with the state than not.
Mm-hmm.
And money and power are very, very intricately intertwined with each other. And money is a system of control, in my opinion. And not only is it a system of control, it's a very good system of control. And part of the reason it's so good is most people don't even understand that it is. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is money, I think this is where you could make the argument. I this in order to just interject for a second. I like to talk about this era starting with the formation of the Bank of England in 1694. Because this is the era of money that we're living in, the central bank control of money and the issuance thereof, and the centralization process of money. And that era is coming to an end. And we're moving into a different era where the state and money are going to be intertwined, but they're going to be intertwined in different ways. And in the transition period to a new monetary system, it's going to be not just it's going to look authoritarian in the short term in order to get to a decentralized money in the long run, because technology is clearly trying to decentralize money. This is what's happening. And so that's where I think we are. And so, when we started the podcast, one of the things we wanted to talk about was this misperception that everybody has. You're the dollar milkshake guy. I'm the Davos guy. We have this, we have our own theories about how America and, America's rebellion against the rules-based order is going to lay itself out. I think that's basically what we're talking about here. What we really need to focus on is, again, not what we want, and that we are going to have to go through a period of authoritarianism in order to get to what we need to where we want to go. Meaning, at the end of the day, sometimes you have to go left to go right. Sometimes you got to go south to go around the mountain. And if the mountain's too big, sometimes you got to go over the mountain. And the mountain is a metaphor for the obstacles of the institutional inertia that exists both in the investor space and the political space, at the state level, at the agency level, in everywhere. And then this is one of the things that you have to overcome. What Donald Trump is doing is literally walking around with a big cleaver that says Gordian on it, and he's like whacking all these Gordian knots all around the world. And everybody's like, "Oh my God, you can't do that." I'm like, "Yeah, I actually can."
Well, the reason he can, and this is the part where people end up hating me. Just and listen, I will say the reason I know that this is the reason people hate me is when I first figured this out, I hated it myself, and I still don't like it, but it's just reality. And that is, once you understand how embedded the euro dollar or the US dollar, however you want to describe that, is not just in the United States, but in the entire world, the idea that they can just change that overnight and move away from it and start something different. It is just not possible to do that without great chaos.
Yep.
And because I think the fact that the euro dollar market developed outside the purview of United States regulators is what allowed it to permeate the entire world. Mm-hmm. And where the world thought they were being very clever and very, by skirting their local regulations and US regulations, and they were meeting a need that was demanded by the market. All of that is true, but they also ended up building their own prison. And while the US does not have perfect control over the US or the Eurodollar market, they have better control over it, or I would say influence over it, than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that you were talking earlier, that the Bank of England and the colonial powers knew how to use money against their colonies as a weapon, believe me, the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve knows how to use the US dollar as a weapon against all of those outside the United States who have taken on enormous amounts of US dollar debt in a currency that they can't print.
Yep.
And so I think what the US is now trying to, and by the way, because the US can influence the Eurodollar market but cannot completely control it, it gives them more control and more ability to protect themselves than everybody else. But that whole Eurodollar market can still boomerang back and hurt the United States as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that because of this design, the US is immune. That is not the case at all.
No.
And in fact, it's because they are not immune that I think they are very much trying to get more control over it than they have now. Mm-hmm. And I think, the merger, either the removal of the Fed or the merger of the Fed to with the Treasury, which I think you and I have talked about this before. I've been talking about this for a couple of years, that I thought this would ultimately happen. And the reason, I know I'm jumping around, but this is important. The reason central banks exist is not just a system of control and exploitation. That's certainly a part of it. But the primary reason they exist is to perpetuate the state itself. They are there to keep the state in business. That is their primary function. Everything else flows down from that. The issue with the Federal Reserve not being a full government entity is they're not independent, but they have a lot of autonomy. Mm-hmm. And that autonomy keeps the government from quote unquote controlling it perfectly. And that's why, and every government ultimately wants control. And so while the autonomy has benefited the United States for a while, I think we're moving into a period of time where the government feels like that autonomy is going to hurt it. So they're going to do everything they can to merge it back in with the Treasury. And you already see this playing out with, the comments about Powell, with Besant. In many ways, the Treasury has been running monetary policy over the last couple of years, somewhat subverting the will of the Fed. And so I think one of the things that Besant has talked a lot about, well, this gets very interesting because, on the one hand, Trump said we're never going to have a central bank digital currency. I think the way he's going to justify that is he's just going to get rid of the central bank, and then we'll have a Treasury digital security as opposed to a central bank.
Yeah. No, that's what's coming. But
right, and so and so the idea of having a U.S. dollar stable coin, in my opinion, the great value in doing that. And remember, this is value as seen from the government's perspective, not seen from the individual's perspective. Mm-hmm. The great value in having a digital U.S. dollar stablecoin, to me, it's not that it will create all this new demand for the debt. I think that's part of it, and I think that will exist. But to me, the big part of it is a new channel, a new distribution channel, a new rail system, plumbing, however you want to describe this, that could eventually migrate the traditional Eurodollar channels into this US dollar stablecoin channel. Mm-hmm. And the US would have much more control over the US dollar stablecoin channel than they do over the traditional Eurodollar channel. And the way I think of it is, several years ago, really, it started after the financial crisis, but it picked up speed probably, 2017, 2018, the whole LIBOR thing in London. The Fed, the U.S. government didn't have control of LIBOR. That was set by, the British banking system. But in many ways, that was the interest rate for the Eurodollar market, right? And I don't think the U.S. liked not having control over that. And so it took them 6, 7, 8 years, but they eventually got that migrated over to SOFR, right? And so I think the same thing could happen with a US dollar stablecoin. It's not going to happen right away. I don't think it could happen right away. As I said earlier, to try to move away from that system immediately would be extremely chaotic. I don't think the US wants it to be chaotic, but they could provide this new system and over time, cannibalize those traditional Eurodollar channels and increase them into the stable. And then pretty soon, then the US has maybe not full control, but much more control than that they have now. So I think that's where it's headed from an overall systems basis.
Mm-hmm.
I think it gives more control to the US. And so to your point earlier, I do think that in many ways, the world is becoming decentralized. In other words, we're not going to have one global market. We're not going to have one global supply chain. And I think we're going to have regional factions and country factions, but within those countries, we could potentially have more decentralization, but I think on a global stage, we're going to have decentralization.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're going to have currency. You're going to have economic blocks that are going to determine how close they want to be. What I've been saying for a while now is that the goal is, I think clearly the goal is to create a domestic digital dollar that trades at one cost basis versus a euro dollar offshore dollar that trades at another cost basis, and that the Fed's job will, in this new environment, if it's to survive at all, will be to enforce that arbitrage in the same way that the PBOC does so with the offshore yuan and the onshore yuan.
Yep.
And that system was forced onto the Russians, and now the ruble doesn't really exist as an international currency. And are they trying to internationalize the ruble? Probably a little bit, but they have to build a financial system capable of handling that, and that's part of where they are now. The Russian story is a different story. It's like how do we get rid of the Bank of Russia? Well, you do exactly what Nabulina is doing, which is by holding interest rates way above market rates, so that private lending and private banks can then begin to issue effectively digital rubles and create a kind of euro ruble scenario that's outside, again, a transmission system outside of that which is under the control of the Bank of Russia. It's a very similar situation. It's a very similar criticism in some ways. I think that's part of the reason why Nabulina is still there. The job is to depreciate the Bank of Russia by allowing her to continue to run her IMF trained, we need to have austerity in order to stop inflation, blah, 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 blah. Well, it's the same situation we have here in the United States with Powell. I think Powell was put in place to do what he's done. I do not think Powell is the guy to manage, and clearly he doesn't want that job anyway, to manage this transition from where we are to where we're going. And what Trump is using Powell as a scapegoat to popularize the idea that the Fed needs to be reformed. And, Jerome Powell doesn't give a shit whether or not, his legacy as he walks out the door is that he's Trump's, Trump's pinata. He doesn't give a shit. He's Jerome Powell. Like, he's a very powerful man who didn't need to do the second term any more than anybody else, any more than Scott Bessent needed to take over Treasury, or Donald Trump needed to be president again. All these men are very, very rich, very independently wealthy, and could have just finished their lives, in their own, quote unquote, in their own private Idahos or whatever you want to call it, and just move on and let the world burn. They could have done that. They all chose not to do that for a variety of reasons. They chose to take on these fights for particular reasons. And so, in order for Trump to turn reforming of the Fed, which is a very unpopular idea, not in our circle, but we're weird. We're in the offshoot of the world to reform the Fed to the normies out there that barely even know that the Fed exists. He's got to turn that into an 80-20 popular issue. Like, Trump is a very 80-20 guy. He likes to take on issues that are 80% of the country are behind and 20% aren't. He ignores the 20% that aren't, focuses on the 80% that are, gets most of that done, moves on to the next thing. And what he also does is create 80-20 arguments, but he has to set the stage for that. He's done this brilliantly throughout his career. You watch him and you see him do this. And I think Fed reform is one of those things. So I know that, you see where I'm going with this, right?
No, and I think the whole Fed, spending $2.3 billion on a remodel that very much helps Trump, right? It helps
Mhm.
him with the populace, right?
Right.
It might not help him with the people on Wall Street, and it might not help him with the people in DC. But you walk into a bar in, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and sit
Yeah,
down next to the construction guy, and you say, "Do you think that the Fed should spend $2.5 billion on a remodel?" Hell no, that guy's going to agree with Trump, right?
exactly.
And so all of this stuff is kind of coming to a head, and this is part of the reason why I think we're going to have a lot of volatility over the next couple of years. And
Agreed.
it doesn't mean the U.S. is immune to this volatility. In fact, I think the U.S. is going to experience a lot of volatility.
Hmm.
But I also think that on a global basis, the U.S. will be the beneficiary
Of course.
of all this volatility.
Agreed.
And so, I know that it's really kind of fascinating to watch, all of the different, analysts or commentators who literally everything that Trump does is bad or
Hmm.
evil or going to fail. The reason I bring, and part of the reason I've talked so much about Trump today is because I don't think you can be an investor on a global stage and not talk about Trump and not think about Trump. It
Right.
would be nice if that was the case, but that's just not reality. And so what I would say to anybody who you know is trying to manage their own portfolios or is allocating assets, and they don't necessarily like the things that Trump is doing, or they don't like him personally. That's fine. That makes sense to me. I get it. But just because Trump is mean, or just because he says things in an you know, polite way, just because he's a bully, it doesn't mean that absolutely everything is going to fail. I mean, the
Hmm.
reality is bullying works. If bullying didn't work, bullies wouldn't exist in the first place. And when people say the world is sick of the United States being the bully, I'm sure the world is sick of the United States being the bully. And then people will say, well, all you have to do is walk up and punch the bully in the nose. Well, the reality is, and I've actually seen this happen before, so this isn't just pure
Hmm.
speculation. Most of the time, when people try to walk up and punch the bully in the nose, they're the ones that get their teeth knocked out.
Hmm.
So it's not as easy as just walking up, punching the bully in the nose, and now everything is kumbaya again. I mean, again, I think we're moving into this period of time where power, is going to make the decisions as opposed to what is right or wrong. Might
Hmm.
makes right, and that's not the ideal situation to have, but I think that's what we're in. And so I think as you analyze your different investments, or you analyze different situations, or you analyze different outcomes, just figure out who actually has the power in those situations as opposed to what you would like to see happen. And I think it will help you make better decisions.
I no, I agree, and that's it's really important. I think we said I remember doing a podcast. I think I was on with Pete Canones, um, and Pete said, "Look, this is the return of power politics. The
Yeah,
return, the age of consensus politics is over. We're not
that's a
dealing with
perfect way to
consensus
say it.
politics. We're
That's
not
a perfect way
dealing
to say
with
it.
consensus politics anymore. We're dealing with
Yep.
power politics, and
Yep.
we have to, and sadly, we have to deal with power politics because consensus politics brought us to this state. And you have to ask yourself, you know, who was presenting us with the consensus politics model and who benefited from the consensus politics model. And it's very clear who benefited from this. And those people, and I happen to call them these fucking people, which is another way of saying Davos or the elite or whatever you want to call them. The people who enforced and created the rules based order, these fucking people are absolutely, livid at the idea that they're not going to be the ones just determining, what power gets expressed in the world. They always like to, express their power through consensus and manipulating the game board to make us all feel like we had a seat at the table, but we actually never really did. They did exactly what they wanted, when they wanted, and how they wanted. These are the same people that Donald Trump is attacking like directly today are the ones. And this, dude, we're doing this on August 11th, and Trump just federalized the law enforcement in DC
Yeah.
4 days before he's going to leave DC to go meet Putin in Alaska while he's putting together indictments against the entire friggin' Obama administration in the Southern District of Florida for Obamagate and everything else. Like
Yep.
shit's happening at a level that, like, if I were Donald Trump, yeah, I'd lock down DC too, because like, you don't think these people are going to try? These people aren't going to try and color revolution and start Maidan in Washington D.C. while he's not there. I mean, it sounds crazy, but this is the level. This is the level of insanity we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who are willing to start and threaten us with a broad-based nuclear war over swampland in eastern Ukraine.
Yep.
Or over Israel, Iran, whatever they have to do in order to try and maintain control over the rules-based order. And Putin has talked about this a tremendous amount. Xi has talked about it to a lesser extent. And I think Trump understands it as well. So the idea that Trump and Putin don't have common ground to work out in Alaska is insane. Of course they do. The question is, what are they going to be able to get done, and in what time frame are they going to be able to get this done? What I would suggest to everybody, expect very little out of Alaska per se at the headline level, but understand that there's architecture being laid and foundations being laid for other things to occur for this to continue moving forward. A long time ago, I haven't said this to you, but I've mentioned it in other podcasts. About 3 or 4 months ago, it was just before, I think it was right around May, maybe, I don't know. Dexter White and I were having one of our typical, afternoon chats, 3 hours long, and we're sitting there, blathering into our iPhones at each other. And he said, we were talking about Russia and Putin and all this. He said, I think honestly, look, Putin and Trump don't trust each other, and neither should they. Right? They both have their agenda. Their agenda is what it is. But if you want to rebuild trust, then whatever phone calls they've had, or whatever correspondence they've had through human interlocutors, which you'll notice that they use human beings to move their messages back and forth, not anything else. I think they both have parallel to-do lists. Like Trump's going to knock one off the board, and then Putin knocks one off the board. And then, we did that great. Now we'll move on to item 2, item 3, item 4, and we'll just continue to do that. So get things to the point where now they can actually make a big move. And I think if you go back and you look at the last 3 or 4 months, certainly you see a lot of these little line items being knocked off the to-do lists. And maybe more on Trump's side than on Putin's side. But then again, the United States has a lot more to prove, because the Russians have, for the most part, acted quite, I wouldn't say honorably, but quite forthrightly about what it is that they want. They've stated their goals very explicitly. And, and in many ways, they are the aggrieved party, not necessarily in Ukraine, where they invaded Ukraine. We know why they invaded Ukraine. We can sympathize with why they invaded Ukraine, but still they invaded Ukraine. From a legal perspective, they invaded a sovereign nation. That cannot be lost in anybody in this conversation. But for the most part, Trump's got a lot of things he's got to knock off his to-do list. And Putin's got to knock some things off of his to-do list as well in order for them to get to this point. I think that to-do lists have gotten to the point where they can have a meeting. And I also think that Trump is going to make Putin realize that, look, this is as far as we're going to go. And, you couldn't stand up to, NATO dropping 250,000 troops into Ukraine, supported by American air power. And we can blow your line open if we need to. This is a dimension of this war that has not been fought yet. I know it's not popular in our circles. I know people think that, the Russians will just knock all our planes out of the sky, I'm like, again, you're sounding an awful like Bitcoin maxis to me in circa 2019, where Bitcoin's going to take over the world because the Fed is hopeless. I got news for you. The Fed's been defending the dollar.
Yep. They're still here.
And Bitcoin's not $1 million a coin
yet. Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. Like I said, I don't know what's going to happen. What I do know is that, to your point, power politics is replacing consensus politics. And perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps that's a bad thing. But regardless of which side you come down on, that's reality. And I think if you look at the world through that lens, you're going to be much better off.
Yeah. And and it may even be, and this is the hard part for people to wrap their brains around, but this is, I believe, I've come to the conclusion, Brent, that this is what needs to happen in order for us to get to the other side of this, where there's a where there's a freer future. This is what I think at this point. It's the world that we've been handed, and sometimes you gotta. I mean, if you want freedom, sometimes you gotta fight for it, and sometimes you may have to just put your trust in the state for a little bit. As much as we all don't want to have that happen, but like at this point, if the institutions are fighting amongst themselves and the people aren't being sent on the ground to fight and die in a meat grinder, and as Trump keeps saying over and over again, I want the killing to stop.
And I think he actually means that.
I know he means
it. I think he actually does. And you don't hear other politicians saying that. And right. I think he deserves, if nothing else, I think he deserves credit for that.
He absolutely does. And I think that Putin is tired of watching Russians on, both ethnic Russians in Ukraine and Ukrainians who he considers, brothers to Russians, die for cynical geopolitical reasons because, a bunch of limeys are still butthurt about the U.S. Civil War. Like, piss off.
Well, we don't have time to get into it now. We've actually got to cut this down. But I will say one thing we didn't really talk about this, but we probably should have, is that part of the reason that Ukraine is such a big deal and why there are so big of lines drawn on each side is Ukraine is like ground zero for the rules-based order. Yeah. Like it is there. Everything of the World Bank of the rules-based order has operated on some level in Ukraine, and there has been so much corruption. I mean, the levels of, there's probably more with the potential, exception of North Korea. It's probably the most corrupt place in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's gone on for so long. And that's why neither side wants to back down, is they're defending their turf. And that's, how many families of senators and congressmen have gone to work on companies in the Ukraine and come back millions of dollars richer. It wasn't just Biden's son who did that. It's on both sides of the aisle. Everyone. And so anyway, hopefully we can bring this battlefield to a close.
I agree, and I'll just to finish that point, and then we'll close the podcast out. The entirety of the rules-based order put in place post World War II was designed for this, to bring this conflict to a head, because the goal was always freeze the conflict and attack Russia again, and you attack Russia through Ukraine. It was always the point of the old order to do this. And what you're watching is, what's hard for people to understand is that the United States is backing out of that system because it doesn't serve, not one, it doesn't even serve our purpose. And two, I think Trump understands the framework of the problem and trying to free the Commonwealth along with the United States from the clutches of City of London, Luxembourg, Zurich, that whole old European banking architecture and European system, and which to them, Ukraine was where they put all their marbles. They can't leave, and they can't back down. So,
fascinating world.
No. What's that? It is a fascinating world, isn't it?
Fascinating.
Okay, so Brent, as always, great to chat with you. Maybe we'll do this again more quicker than the last time because I think we never really have enough time to do everything we'd like to talk about. So tell everybody where they can find you and do the thing and do the self plug, and we'll get at it.
No, I appreciate it. So there's a bunch of different. I'm obviously very if you don't already know, I'm very active on Twitter. You can find me under Santiago Capital. Santiago AU Fund is the actual handle. We do a lot of stuff on Substack. If you go to research.santiagocapital.com, there's a couple different ways to follow us there. If you like the topics that we were talking about today, we do a lot of writing and putting out reports related to kind of the intersection of geopolitics and capital markets. And then every weekend I do a show on YouTube called Milkshake's Markets and Madness, where we just kind of go over a number of things that we see going on in the world. So I appreciate you having me on. Happy to talk to you again at some point down the road and see how this world is developing.
I appreciate it. And yeah, so follow Brent, do the thing. And you guys can find me as always, TFL1728 on Twitter. If I'm not more active than Brent, that would be funny. Patreon/Gold Ghosts and Guns if you want to, support what we do here. So that's that. He's Brent. I'm Tom. We're out. Keep your stick on the ice.